Hi, everyone. This is Kim Wehle, Simple Politics. I am delighted to welcome my guest today, Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, to talk about all things Washington. Senator, thank you for taking the time today to talk to me on Simple Politics.
Well, Professor, it's great to be with you, and I look forward to our conversation.
So let me ask you this first. Why I see that you were born in Pakistan, that you have a parent that was in the Foreign Service, a mother who was in the CIA. Was there any chance you were going to do something other than government service, given how you were raised, or did something else lead you to this long career in government service?
Well, it was probably a little bit in the DNA and in the nurturing, the nature and the nurturing. But look, my father was from Baltimore. He went into the Navy and then he went into the Foreign Service. And just before he did, he met my mom, who, as you mentioned, was also involved in government. She was a Russian expert. She knew many languages, and it was a great partnership. So I grew up many of my earlier years back and forth in the Foreign Service. It's like kids in the military. You go overseas and then you come back. But that experience did shape many of my views, both in terms of American leadership overseas, but also when you hold up a mirror to trying to make sure America actually lives up to the sort of image and the principles that we espouse overseas. And as you know, that the challenge of our country has been meeting those promises.
And so I read you're on the Foreign Services Committee in the Senate, and it's interesting that your mother was a Russia expert. I can't help but ask, where do you think we stand with Vladimir Putin and Russia? And do you think China is a bigger or as big of a concern right now for Americans, and why?
Well, what we see with Vladimir Putin was a sort of reversion to sort of the Russian autocratic days. We went through, of course, the period of the Soviet Union, and then uh, the Berlin Wall came down. We had me call it Gorbachev. We thought there would be a little opening, but that was slowly snuffed out. And now we have an authoritarian leader in Putin who is, again, trying to impose his model wherever he can in different parts of the world. But while Russia remains, a huge military power, they do not have the economic punch that really is needed to expand their influence and model around the world. Whereas in China, while they are at least currently a smaller military power, still a significant military power, they are, of course, a huge economic power, and they couple that power with an authoritarian model. And not only do they have a growing and dynamic economy at home, but they use that power in kind of a mercantilist way to export not only China's goods, but their authoritarian model in parts of the world. And we're seeing this, of course, in Hong Kong, where they totally violated their commitments to a freer and open Hong Kong. They have what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a nice sounding name for development projects around the world. But the price a lot of countries pay in terms of getting the benefits of the Belt and Road program is giving up into a lot of Chinese influence, including cracking down on information freedom, things like that. So we are in the Congress, at least so far, on a bipartisan basis, working to develop an overall strategy to respond to China that, in many ways, begins in strengthening us right here at home, where we've underinvested in so many key areas, from early education to cutting edge technology. So this is going to be a big issue for our country going forward.
I've had a Russia expert, Evelyn Farkas, on the show a few times. I had Bonnie Glazer, an expert in China, on the show to break these things down. And both of them seized in their own way on this idea of authoritarianism and this notion that that itself is a threat to America. And I wonder if you could weigh in on that, because I think when some people think about China and think about Russia, but particularly China, I'd say that's so far away, that doesn't affect me. we're democracy, we'll always be democracy. We can separate those regimes from what we have. That's not really a threat. And though the experts I mentioned didn't see it that way, do you agree that the fact that, or the influence of China and Russia and wanting to impose a different kind of world order does affect everyday Americans potentially?
Yes, it does. I know both your earlier guests that you mentioned, and I agree with them. And if you look at, Freedom House, which is a nonpartisan organization that sort of measures freedom and democracy around the world, they're reporting that the world is becoming less free. I mean, you have countries like China and Russia that we've already talked about, but you also see a tendency in some countries that have been fully democratic becoming more authoritarian: Hungary, Poland, Turkey. And yes, the emergence of more authoritarian regimes does hurt our national security. And of course, if you go back to World War II, this country recognized that in that case, fascism from Nazi Germany would be a threat to democracy, and that we shouldn't just say we're separated by these big oceans and so it can never touch us. And that's even more true today, where the world is much more interconnected. And when these ideas of authoritarianism grow, it impacts on Americans' ability to engage in the world, and slowly would put the United States at a huge disadvantage, because we're an economy that, with all its problems, and we need to dramatically reform the way our economy operates in certain areas, especially massive wealth inequality. But the reality is that the authoritarian regime is essentially where you have government-centered, government-controlled influence over the marketplace and ideas. And when you snuff out freedom of the press and freedom of ideas, we will all eventually, be the losers. And so that is what's happening if we are not smart about, making sure we're strong here at home, but also, preventing, for example, China from seeking to impose that authoritarian model in other parts of the world.
So I want to shift to your point that we need to pay attention to what's happening at home. And I've worried about this now as a constitutional scholar for several years. This drip, drip, drip away from democracy. Justice, I think Douglas said that it's when democracy dies, it will be in a slow process, not we wake up one morning and it's gone. And so what comes to mind, I was paraphrasing, but what comes to mind are three things, Senator, that I'm concerned about. One is the January 6th insurrection. Two is what's happening to access to the ballot across the country in terms of voter suppression laws. When I know that's become kind of a sort of a trigger word, but that means efforts to make it harder for people to register and harder for people to actually vote. And then the third piece is also legislation in the state level to penalize protesters legally. And you were at in the state legislature for 11 years by my count. Which of those things are you most worried about, and how? And if you could take them one by one, what is the Congress doing about it? Let's start with insurrection. What is the United States Congress really doing about that? Because I sat on my couch as your constituent, spent a lot of my life on the mall with my kids, horrified by what I saw. We had 11 investigations into Benghazi, and it just seems like January 6th is in the rearview mirror. So could we start with that? What's going on? What is the Democrats doing about that?
Right. These are all very alarming developments for our country. And I mentioned the Freedom House grades in the context of the rest of the world. They've also sort of taken the United States down a number of points because of erosion in certain democratic norms. And they mentioned, for example, the arrests of some journalists and protesters. They also mentioned the arbitrary firing of independent inspector generals by the previous administration and some of our government agencies. But let's start with January 6th, which was a very dark day for our democracy. You know, we think of these awful moments in our history, the attack on Pearl Harbor, September 11th, 2001. These were external attacks on our democracy. What we saw on January 6th was an internal attack on our democracy. And it was fueled by the big lie that, you know, the former president perpetrated after he lost the last election. As you know, they brought 62 cases in the courts of the country. They won one that had very insignificant impact. And then the, you know, former attorney general, for all I disagreed with him on all sorts of things, said that, you know, they looked at it and the Justice Department of the Trump administration didn't find any violations. And the Department of Homeland Security, President Trump's designee on election security, said it was the most accurate count ever. And yet you saw Donald Trump perpetrating this big lie, which undermines the integrity of our elections, and then led to the president directing a violent mob to attack the Capitol on January 6th. The day, I mean, not a random day, the day that we were taking the count from the Electoral College to finalize the presidential election. So make no mistake, it's a direct attack on our election. And the other thing you mentioned in terms of state legislatures, we can talk about that, is a continuation of the big lie. And it's a very dangerous development in our country. No one should underestimate it.
Well, and it's not just Donald Trump. It's also members of the United States Senate who were not behind any accountability during when there was a vote on the second impeachment. It was a bipartisan vote to impeach, but ultimately, with not enough votes to actually to make a decision to convict, which would have prevented him from being on the ballot. And then, of course, over 100 members, Republican members of the House of Representatives, who signed on to a lawsuit out of Texas seeking to affirmatively cancel votes in other states, to not just keep people from the polls, but to literally snatch people's votes, legitimate votes. And some of those colleagues of yours are still adhering to that lie. And I think it worries certainly a lot of people, and not just small d Democrats, right? Or, you know, or I should say big D Democrats, those who vote with Democrats. It worries a lot of people. So what is happening to address January 6th? And I say that not so much accountability for Donald Trump. I mean, as someone who lives nearby, why did this happen? Where was law enforcement? Why weren't more arrests made? You know, your colleague Sheldon Whitehouse has sort of flagged this question of, you know, people within the United States Congress, maybe within the administration, who are complacent, who had knowledge, were giving tours to the rioters. It just seems to me that this is something we need to understand as Americans, so it doesn't happen again, regardless of who's in power, because it was such a colossal meltdown. And I know Nancy Pelosi has asked for, flagged an idea of a 9/11 style independent commission. I know you're a lawyer. And a lot of the reason I think, I tell my students, the 62 lawsuits failed because judges are bound by rules and they're bound by procedural and evidentiary constraints. So what can people who are worried expect from the United States Congress? What's happening now? And are we going to actually see some real movement on getting to the bottom of what happened on that day?
So you're right. And I realize I sort of flipped the order of the questions, but accountability is going to be very important. So let me just start with different pieces of it. One is, you know, the accountability for the people who are directly involved in the violence. And it's going to be very important to demonstrate that they're held to account, that they are prosecuted to the full extent of the law for the different crimes that were committed that day. That's really important. And I know that the Justice Department is committed to doing that. The Justice Department, with the new Attorney General, Merrick Garland, is also very determined to crack down on hate crimes and some of the huge racial undertones that formed so much a part of the previous administration. And of course, we saw people carrying Confederate flags on January 6th, as well as Holocaust deniers and others. So it's going to be very important that the Justice Department, monitor and use all the laws at our disposal to crack down on sort of domestic insurrection. And of course, the Attorney General recently visited Oklahoma City, where we had the terrible bombing by Timothy McVeigh, and you sort of can draw some lines here. Now, in terms of congressional action and a 9/11 style commission, it's something I supported early after this, but it's really important that a 9/11 commission formed take the same kind of professional approach as we saw from the actual 9/11 commission. And right now, that has been the impediment. It's the reason, Speaker Pelosi's proposal to create a commission has not yet, been formed, because you mentioned Republicans in the House and Senate who really aided and abetted the big lie. And that is very true. And that remains deeply troubling and problematic, not just spouting the lie, but also voting against the results of a Democratic election. One of those people, of course, was the Republican leader in the House, Kevin McCarthy. And under these bills, what we worry about is people like McCarthy using their appointment power to put people on a commission that would make a mockery of what we need to do. Last thing we need is for people on the commission to use it as a vehicle to perpetrate fraud on the American people. And so it just needs to be designed properly, and that's the issue going forward.
So I wonder if you could explain for listeners who don't necessarily understand the ins and outs of Congress or how things work. And actually, a lot of Americans, only a third can, the Annenberg Center polls show that only a third can even name the three branches. So it's a little bit opaque. Can you explain why is it that if the Democrats have the House, they have the Senate by one vote, that is the vice president, and the White House, why sort of they're not able to sort of have a neutral commission to not investigate, the Justice Department and local prosecutors are dealing with the bad deed doers on the day who came, but the government, our government, what happened on the inside out? Why is it that's not doable with all of this power? And I invite you in that regard to explain and talk about this wonky word known as the filibuster.
Right. Well, that does go to the heart of the issue, right? And I can imagine confusion around the country, because you're right, you have a Democratic majority in the House, a small one, a very small one, but nevertheless a majority. Democratic majority in the Senate, the narrowest possible. It's 50-50. And I think everyone's gotten a refresher civics lesson that the Vice President of the United States casts the deciding vote. But in the Senate, we also have something called the filibuster rule. And what that allows is for any, determined 40 members of the Senate to block a final vote on any piece of legislation they want. And what we've seen is, people just using that now as a matter of routine. And, people like Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, have just decided that they're going to always deploy the filibuster. So just for what that means is that if I can keep 40 out of 100 senators together, I can block the will of the 60 senators who represent a majority. And I'm in favor of eliminating the filibuster, and at the very least radical reform, because in my view, it's an anti-democratic, and I mean democratic with a small d, an anti-democratic layer process on top of what is already by design an anti-democratic institution, the United States Senate. What do I mean by that? You know, the state of Wyoming that has a smaller population than the District of Columbia, which I think should have statehood, but the state of Wyoming has the same number of senators as the state of California. So you already have an institution where certainly the majority of the American people don't have a vote. The vote of a senator from Wyoming is stronger per person than California or Maryland. And what the filibuster does, and the filibuster is an invention of the Senate, nowhere to be found in the Constitution. The framers set up a system of checks and balances. What this does is another check against the majority, against democracy in the United States Senate. So the answer to your question is, in order for us to fashion a commission in a way that we think is fair, or in order to pass the For the People Act, which is to protect our elections on a national basis, under current rules, we need to overcome a filibuster of 60. And it's just crazy in my view to have a system where a minority of senators can block a provision that's designed to protect our democracy based on majority vote.
So, I mean, I don't know if you think this is a fair comparison, but when I think of this, the idea of, well, if we create a commission, there might be some people that take it in a direction that undermines the integrity of it. We have legislation that a bipartisan majority of Americans want. Take gun control, for example. But you have a small minority that almost are in the audience throwing tomatoes, right, at the stage. Like it's just putting a wrench in things. And for viewers, just for clarification, the two senators per state is in the Constitution. The filibuster is not. But the critics, and I had my dean, Ron Weich, who was a former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid's counsel. He's against getting rid of the filibuster. His response is, well, then we're going to be just throwing tomatoes at each other back and forth. Okay, so the Democrats amend the filibuster, they get all this legislation through, and if we have time, I'd love to talk about We the People Act, voting rights. I think it's absolutely vital to the integrity of an ongoing, democracy. Other things that are important, the infrastructure bill, things like that. But that if the majority changes to the other party, they'll just undo everything, and it'll be ping pong back and forth. We'll just pass legislation and then unpass legislation, and it'll be kind of like what happened in getting rid of the filibuster with Supreme Court nominees, where there are 3 justices on the Supreme Court that got on the court with, and maybe I'm missing a vote or two, with virtually no Democratic support, and they're there for life. So what do you say to that critique that, okay, it's there for a reason, but if you get rid of it, it's just going to be even more of a mudslinging fest in the United States Congress?
Well, I disagree. I understand that there are risks to getting rid of a filibuster rule. I mean, there are things that may have gotten through the whole process in the past that I was glad we were able to block it with a filibuster. But right now, I think the much greater risk to our country is massive gridlock on issues that are of fundamental importance. And I believe the ultimate accountability mechanism is elections, right? If you don't like what the Senate passed with 51 votes, vote against your senator. We already have checks and balances. We're not a parliamentary system, right? In a parliamentary system, as you know, the head of government is the head of the party that won, and you do see swings. But those are democratic systems. We already have built into our system checks and balances that don't exist in those other democratic systems. And so the 60 vote out of 100 rule just gums up the works, in my view, and undermines democracy. The framers put enough checks and balances in the system. Elections are the ultimate recourse.
Could you summarize for listeners who don't follow the names of bills, and what would the We the People Act do, and why, if you agree with me, is it so important regardless of politics? And I say that because, we're in this polarized, it's overused, but it's a very team mentality. Team blue, team red. If I'm on team red, I'm just going to discount what team blue says. If I'm on team blue, I'm going to discount what team red says because I'm for my team. It could be a sports team. I'm forever, a Yankees fan or whatever. To me, this bill is not red or blue, but can you explain in nuts and bolts what it is and why? I mean, you can't climb in my mind, but you're a lawyer. Why, from a constitutional standpoint, would that be the case? What's the argument
Yeah.
for that?
Well, I do think this is a nonpartisan bill, although, the debate has become very partisan and polarized in the Congress, as you say. But there should be nothing partisan about trying to establish minimum standards to protect voting around the country. And that, in essence, is what a major provision of the We the People Act. And, we did speak earlier about the January 6th insurrection and the big lie. What we've seen as a result is the state legislatures like Georgia, like Texas, now trying to change the rules to make it harder for many people to vote, harder for lower income people to vote, especially in communities of color and younger people. So it's an attempt to win elections, not by addition, not by debate and persuading more people of your ideas or your platform, but by actually putting up barriers to the ballot box. And so what the We the People Act does is say, look, we need some minimum national standards, protecting voter registration, absentee balloting, rules of the roads, early voting. Let's create these national protections. I should also add that it would get rid of secret money in politics. Right now, gobs of money are spent by corporations to purchase TV advertising that all voters are watching, but voters don't have a right to know who's spending all that money to influence their vote. This is a bill that I passed while I was in the House. It was defeated on a filibuster in the Senate, 59 votes out of 100 in favor, but you needed 60 to break a filibuster. And only because Ted Kennedy had passed away and a Republican senator took his place did that pass. But that's an example. So the Disclose Act, standards in voting, these are fundamental ideas to protect our democracy and the right to vote. They shouldn't be Republican or Democratic.
So do you think it's possible to get this through? I mean, is there a way to maybe just do the John Lewis part, which would be to repair the Voting Rights Act of 1965 so that when states try to do these maneuverings about access to the ballot, there'd be a second check on it? Or do you think you need to do it either through appropriations, which again, for the viewers, you get sort of, if you do it, call it an appropriation bill, you could do it with a bare majority. Is it possible, do you think, to tweak it to get enough Republican support to get that through? I saw your quote on the Federal Election Commission overhaul, which we can talk about. You said Republicans want to keep the agency, it broken because they want to be able to skirt the law with impunity. So for viewers, the FEC just doesn't really function right now because it's supposed to be the cop on the block for election and campaign finance stuff. It's just not functioning because of the way it's structured. You want to fix that. Republicans don't want to fix that. So when I hear this, Senator, I say, are we just so stuck? We're stuck because they just don't want people to vote. They don't want, whoever they are, they don't want a cop on the block to make sure big money doesn't drown out, the views of regular people. How do we get around this? Are these bills realistic?
Well, they don't want a cop on the block at the FEC. They do not want the Disclose bill to pass. I mean, Mitch McConnell's been very clear. He wants to perpetuate secret money in politics. I've debated back and forth with him, not in person, but at some of the think tanks in Washington, and he totally flip-flopped on this issue from the early 2000s. So he supports corporations being able to spend tens of millions of dollars without letting the voters know who's doing it. And Republicans do not want uniform national rules of the road to protect voting, because that would prevent these state legislatures that are controlled by Republicans from voting to put up barriers to voting. If you have a national law that prevents that, then they can't try to win elections by subtraction, by making it harder for people to vote. So this gets back to our earlier question. As you suggested, there is a rule in the Senate that allows us to pass bills that are related to the budget through what's called reconciliation. And under that special procedure for budget-related matters, you can pass something with 51 votes, and you don't have to go through a filibuster to get there. That is how we just passed the American Rescue Plan. Everyone should know, because that was overwhelmingly popular around the country with Republicans, Democrats, and independents, but not a single Republican senator voted for it. And had the exception to the filibuster rule for budget bills not been there, it would have been filibustered, and we wouldn't have emergency relief. And to get back to our point, what kind of system is it where you have an exception to the filibuster rule for budget-related laws like the American Rescue Plan, but you don't have an exception for laws or proposals like the For the People Act that are designed to protect the democracy itself? Yeah. This is why I think we got to get rid of the filibuster. Yes, there are risks, but it is impeding our democracy, small d.
So, we have midterm elections coming up in 2022. I mean, it's kind of around the corner. And I'll just say, off the cuff, talking to political pundits inside Washington, my friends, there's a strong view that one or both of the houses, as is traditional, will go to Republicans. And I don't know. I don't watch the polls, but I ask you because I agree with you completely. The way out of all of this is voting, voting, voting. Get to the polls, get to the polls. And even with the barriers, we saw this in Georgia. People still got to the polls and made their. So why isn't that this message around what seems like common sense? Access is good for people. $1,400 checks are good for people in a pandemic. The ability to build bridges and roads, the infrastructure bill, and actually have Wi-Fi in every home. This helps everybody. Why is this message stuck somehow? In that it's the margins you think are still so slim that we have an anti-majoritarian movement really from the right, from the party of Lincoln, which started out as an anti-slavery party. I mean, it's not consistent with the roots to be sort of that way, but that's one way. And then you have Democrats with the large D, that is the party, working towards these reforms, but voters don't seem to get that. Are you worried about the midterms, and how do you reach those people?
Well, I worry about every election in the sense I don't take any election for granted. And I used to chair the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, which is in charge of elections for Senate Democrats. And during my time in the House, headed the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So let me just briefly say, with respect to the upcoming Senate elections, the Democrats have a chance to pick up some seats. There are a lot of open Republican Senate seats, for example, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Missouri, in North Carolina. There's a seat in Wisconsin that will be contested. But at the same time, Democrats need to defend seats in Maryland, but in Georgia, where you mentioned the election in Georgia, we have two new senators, Reverend Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. And by the way, they won under the fair and more open rules in Georgia. Georgia's now trying to change those rules to make it harder for a Raphael Warnock or a John Ossoff to be elected by constraining people's right to vote. So that is why this is important. But here's the other point, and you hit right on it. When the American people see gridlock, they, of course, will blame the party in power. And as we're discussing, we have thin, but we have majorities in the House, Senate, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the White House. So if nothing gets done, everyone's fighting, people will say, oh my God, let's change course. That was why it was so important that we passed the American Rescue Plan, and that we did it even with 51 votes and didn't wait for Republicans who were never going to get on board. It's why it's really important we passed the American Jobs Act, the Infrastructure Modernization Bill. We're going to have the American Families Act proposal coming up. And it is my strong view that while we all prefer to do this in a bipartisan basis, and President Biden has, invited and encouraged Republicans to come up with their own proposals for infrastructure and to pay for it, which they never want to, that we should move forward. And we do have the vehicle of reconciliation on those budget bills to do that in the United States Senate. And so we definitely need, in my view, to move forward to that. People want results. They just want results. Having served in the House when Barack Obama had the recovery bill, the Republicans in the Senate whittled it down. And then when it passed, it did not do enough to lift the economy before those midterms, 2010 midterms. And then Republicans complained that the recovery was too slow when they whittled down and then voted against the recovery bill in the first place. So bottom line, my view, be bold, go big.
A couple other things that I know you have to go, but I wanted two important things that are on the table right now. One is DC statehood. Can you explain what that means and what, it has an impact for people who live in Washington, D.C., but a lot of people in America have never been to Washington, D.C. And then the second one, I wonder if you could talk about the George Floyd bill, the police reform issue that is on the front of everyone's mind, given the conviction of a former Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, for 2 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter in the killing of George Floyd this week.
Sure. So the people of the District of Columbia are the only people in our country who are denied the ability to have a voting representative in the House and voting representatives in the Senate. People in all the 50 states have that right. They have that representation, that voting representation in Washington. The people of the District of Columbia do not have that, even though their population is bigger than 2 of our states, bigger than Wyoming, bigger than Vermont. Part of the American Revolution was, no taxation without representation. The people of the District of Columbia pay more in federal income taxes than those in 22 other states, but they can't vote for their House member or senators who are going to be levying federal taxes on them. They serve in the armed forces. The way we admit new states to the Union is the way the District of Columbia, the people of the District of Columbia want to. They had a referendum and they want to be admitted. And so the House of Representatives just passed legislation to admit the people of the District of Columbia. Joe Biden has said he will sign the bill. So it's in the United States Senate. We should pass it. But getting back to the filibuster rule, since it's not a budget-related measure, we can't use that reconciliation process to pass with 51 votes. It would need to be either an exception to the filibuster rule or change the filibuster rule. So you have another situation where an anti-democratic filibuster rule is blocking a measure intended to live up to our democracy. I have my Republican colleagues talking about we need more democracy around the world, and I agree with them. They're complaining about China cracking down on Hong Kong. I agree. We have a bipartisan bill to sanction China for doing that. And yet here at home in our nation's capital, they don't want democracy. So we need to keep pushing. In terms of police reform, and of course, we just saw the results in the trial in the George Floyd case, a trial outcome that was just, but we need to make sure we have systemic change. And that means more police accountability. In Maryland, the state legislature just passed something, overcame the governor's veto on a big piece of it, to provide more transparency and accountability in policing. We need to do the same thing at the federal level. And that's what the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would do, provide more transparency and accountability so that when you have police misconduct, people can have faith that people who engage in misconduct are held accountable. And all police should want this because, police should want those that are violating their oath to defend the community to be held accountable. I believe in addition to that, we need to change the system. And is this a good time to mention a bill I'm working on with
Please, yeah.
So if you look at these cases, so many of them don't require a police use of force response. Many police encounters are with people who have sort of mental illness, mental health issues, homeless people. And so I believe we need some systemic change here, and we need a system, an emergency response system that's tailored to the kind of encounter that's needed. And if you have a mental health situation, we should be deploying people who are trained and expert in dealing with a mental health situation. And so Karen Bass, who's Congresswoman from California, and I've introduced a bill called the Community Response Bill. And it will encourage cities and jurisdictions, doesn't mandate anything, encourage them to develop these alternative response systems so that we can have fewer cases that result in unnecessary escalation and unjust death and killings. And so this is another important piece of it that we're pursuing.
Yeah, I think that's vital. So two pieces. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. So just knowing what your government is doing is really important. And dealing with policing, it's not taking away police, but it's being a more compassionate, tailored police force. And we could talk long and hard about that as well. So fascinating. But I know you have to go. I want to thank you, Senator Van Hollen, for a really interesting, enlightening conversation. I really appreciate your time today.
Well, it's great to be with you, Professor, and look forward to coming back at some point. Thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Sorry to go on some of these, but they are big.
No, don't apologize. You're very good at breaking
trying to break it down. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And that's what people like, at least for my viewers. Thank you.
Thank you.